All right, so we have some pretty big updates here on the $3.5 trillion infrastructure package, as well as the shitty, watered-down Republican infrastructure package, which is the bipartisan version, as Nancy Pelosi has actually extended the deadline for when she wants to have a vote on both of these packages to the end of October. Okay, so here from Forbes, it's about time. Pelosi sets a new October 31st deadline for passing infrastructure bills. So if you remember, this is pretty big news, right? Because over the last week, I was telling you guys that last week was really supposed to be the week that we were going to find out exactly what was going to happen to these two bills, particularly because Nancy Pelosi had made a somewhat of a loose deal with some of these corporate Democrats in the House and in the Senate, specifically Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, and then Josh Gottenheimer and the rest of those corrupt Democrats in the House. She made a deal with them, basically saying we are going to bring the bipartisan infrastructure bill for a vote by the end of September. And now that obviously that date has passed and we have not had a vote on the infrastructure package, and that is basically entirely because the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, AOC, the rest of the squad actually held firm and have been using their leverage as a united voting bloc in order to prevent the bipartisan bill from being passed without the reconciliation bill being tied to it. Now, I've been giving them heaps of credit as of right now, especially to Bernie Sanders, because up until this point, Bernie Sanders has been accurately pointing out that the initial reconciliation bill that they wanted was $6 trillion. Now, Manchin is coming to the table and he is saying he wants something only as high as $1.5 trillion. So the $3.5 trillion number is the middle ground. That was already the moderate compromise between the Bernie Sanders and the Joe Manchin factions of the Democratic Party, okay? $3.5 trillion was already the compromise. That's what Bernie Sanders has been saying this entire time. And so I have been hoping that they would not budge a single goddamn dollar under that $3.5 trillion number. Now, it seems like they are going to have to do that, and it seems like they are now bending basically to the whim of Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, and the rest of these corrupt Democrats. They are now folding a little bit and are conceding that, yes, they are going to have to cut back on some of this upper top line budget costs, basically. But I think that's completely ridiculous. Obviously, they have a lot of leverage here, and they should have been sticking to this $3.5 trillion number. But I have actually heard some good ideas in terms of how they could go about doing this without taking away a lot of the substance and the material benefits to the American people that are in this $3.5 trillion bill, specifically here from AOC. And she's not the only person who's had this idea, but I think it's somewhat of a good one, right? If you need to appease the Manchins and the Cinemas of the world, and there's no guarantee that this would actually work, but if you want to make an attempt to appease them by lowering that $3.5 trillion number without gutting the programs that are within this bill, you could do something like this. So here from AOC, to lower the bill's price tag, says AOC, shorten the duration, but don't gut the program. So Representative AOC of New York argued Sunday that the best way to lower the price tag of Democrats' emerging reconciliation package may be to shorten the duration of proposed social programs instead of gutting their funding or removing them from the bill entirely, and acknowledging that dropping the legislation's top-line price tag below $3.5 trillion over a decade, which is $350 billion a year, mind you, okay, half of what we were spending yearly on our military budget, but they continue saying that if they are going to, so acknowledging that dropping the legislation's top-line price tag below $3.5 trillion over a decade will likely be necessary to win the must-have votes of Senators Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and other corporate-backed conservative Democrats, Ocasio-Cortez said that one of the ideas that is out there, fully fund what we can fully fund, but maybe instead of doing it over 10 years, we fully fund it for 5 years, and proponents of such an approach would ensure that people experience tangible benefits from the new programs, thus increasing the likelihood that they'll be extended into the future. And this is something that is really the case for a lot of these universal programs, right? This is why it's so hard for Republicans to go and gut even Obamacare, or whether it's so hard, why it's so hard for them to gut Medicare, why it's so hard for them to gut Social Security, is because these are universal programs that everybody likes, okay? Obviously, Medicare is only 65 plus, or etc., but a lot of these programs, when you make them more universal and anybody who is fitting within the criteria is able to use them, they're significantly harder, especially when they're very popular programs that are working for millions and millions of people. They're significantly harder to cut, right? So if you were to implement a child tax benefit, or if you were to implement lowering prescription drug prices for a 5-year window, or whatever the policy may be, if you are going to get that within a 5-year window, then you have 5 years for people to look at that and see the material benefits and say, God damn, this is kind of helping my life. We should definitely be extending this into the future. And in addition to that, it would also somewhat help Democrats electorally, because come 2024 or 2022 even, you could be saying, look, you are voting for us to maintain these policies. You are voting for us because if Republicans are elected, they're going to have the ability to prevent these programs from being extended. So it kind of makes sense electorally. It kind of makes sense in terms of lowering that overall price tag to try to appease some of these corrupt motherfuckers in the Senate and the House. And in addition to that, you could do this basically without completely gutting any of the actual substance behind these programs. So I think this is somewhat of a good compromise, somewhat of a good deal that they could be making to not actually end up gutting these bills, which would be, in my opinion, completely unacceptable and would make them not really worth passing. But we had another hopeful sign here from Pramila Jayapal. She was on CNN's State of the Union on Sunday, and she said that in the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus flatly rejected Manchin's $1.5 trillion proposal as inadequate, and Jayapal and other leading progressives, including Ocasio-Cortez and Senators Bernie Sanders, have made clear that they view the $3.5 trillion spending over 10 years as the compromising figures, as they should. And they continue saying that as part of an effort to pare back their own party's reconciliation bill, Manchin and other conservative Democrats have advocated means testing as a way to limit the costs of proposed social programs such as Medicare expansion, an approach that progressives have slammed as morally and politically indefensible. And during her CNN interview, Jayapal noted that, quote, research shows that means testing does not actually target it more, but it does create a lot of administrative burden and a lot more cost. So I think this is a really important point here, right? If you are going to lower that overall price tag, it makes a lot more sense to make it over a 5-year period instead of a 10-year period without actually gutting any of the substance behind these programs. But in addition to that, she's making a really good point here in terms of what means testing actually does. And this is what Joe Manchin is trying to push for right now. He wants all of these programs, whether it's a child tax benefit or whether it's free community college. He wants them to be as heavily means tested as possible. And listen, I've made this point 1,000 times before. Means testing, as Pramila Jayapal was just accurately pointing out right there, means testing does not work in the way that Joe Manchin or other corporate Democrats would like you to believe that it works, or other neoliberals would like you to believe that it works. Means testing is more costly. It is less effective. It leads to people who need some of this aid not ending up getting the aid. And all it ends up doing is appeasing these corrupt motherfuckers in the House and the Senate who want to keep the most poor and vulnerable people in the country in their place. That's all that means testing does. And really, if you cared about the overall spending and you're like, well, I don't want some rich person to be able to send their kid to free community college, which I don't know why the fuck you would be opposed to that. But if you were opposed to that, then guess what? You can raise taxes on the wealthy, you can raise taxes on the rich, you can raise taxes on corporations on the back end so that you don't have to end up means testing this in the front end. And this is exactly what we could have done for, say, the stimulus checks, right? Instead of means testing the shit out of the stimulus checks, you could have sent them out to everybody. It would have been faster. It would have been somewhat less costly. And then on top of that, if you wanted to recoup some of the money by saying, oh, well, stimulus checks were going out to wealthy people, then guess what? You can raise the wealthy's taxes and then they will end up paying that back to the government. Okay, so these are types of compromises that actually make sense, right? But means testing doesn't make sense. Gutting the portions of the bill that are extremely popular among the American people doesn't make sense. So there's a way that they could go about this next months of negotiation process and do it in an effective way that keeps the substance of this bill while not allowing it to be gutted by people like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, while also lowering the overall price tag, even though that's not something that we should be having to do right now, because all of these concerns from Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema are obviously completely fabricated nonsense bullshit talking points, and they are obviously not acting in good faith. They're acting on behalf of their corporate donors and their own personal self-interest. So we really should not be having to take these people seriously, but if you are going to have to compromise in some way, there is an effective way to go about doing that compromise, right, without actually selling out the American people. And just to give you a perspective on where Joe Biden is at, so Biden has pitched lawmakers on a compromise that would include as much as $2.3 trillion in new spending, but Manchin has said the package should top out at $1.5 trillion. That $1.5 trillion is an absolute slap in the face and not worth passing. So don't listen to Joe Manchin. That $1.5 trillion is a laughably ridiculous number. Joe Biden is saying somewhat like $2.3 trillion. I would think it would be somewhere up in like 2.5, 2.7 trillion if you were going to pare it back from 10 years over a 5-year window. Instead, you could dramatically lower the cost, basically almost in half. You could be dramatically lowering the cost of the overall bill while keeping all of the major portions that are popular among the American people and that the American people desperately need, keeping those intact. So I think this is an interesting idea from AOC. Let me know what you guys think. But honestly, I mean, the last thing we want to see is progressives compromising on the actual substance of this bill. So if they are in the mindset, which it seems like they are right now, that they do have to compromise on the overall price tag of this bill, let's not compromise on the substance of it and actually do it in a nuanced and an effective way.